Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. And I know you, as well as I, are anxious to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. We closed yesterday in our research of how the Pope gained his temporal power in the world as a King of Kings and Lord of Lords, counterfeiting the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the counterfeit Christ on earth, the Pope of Rome, and how he used his temporal power to enslave God's people. We should have known better, and our churches should know better today and should be preaching these truths, these historical and prophetic truths, so that all of us can understand what's going on. But you're privileged to have Inquisition Update in your ears this morning, and I'm going to continue our reading and discussion of this book by backing up a paragraph for continuity purposes, and listen carefully to the admonition of this wise man as he says, "We have but to look at the manner in which the popes employed their spiritual authority in order to promote temporal and secular ends, to see how the church was made to violate the injunctions of its founder, the example of the apostles, and the peaceful teachings of the early Christians. The retrospect reflects no credit upon those who became the active agents in these measures, but is made necessary by the enormous pretensions now set up in behalf of the papacy. And it will serve to show also how necessary it is." Here's where it gets important for us. Listen to this. "And it will serve to show also how necessary it is for the best interests of mankind that the nations shall not again suffer the church and the state to be united." This is the great warning of all the knowledgeable historians and men of God that we read and quote here on Inquisition Update, that the greatest, most recognizable sign that Rome is having control in your country is when you see a union of church and state taking place. The union of church and state, as we'll continue to read in this book, characterized the dark days of the medieval ages, when the Pope ruled supreme over the kings of the earth, and the people were nothing but abject slaves, dumbed down, denied education, denied opportunity, filled with superstition and this bogus belief that the Pope somehow represents the holy God of heaven on this earth. And we see this reunion of church and state taking place in the United States today. This is what this book is written to warn us about. And that's why it is so important for my listeners. And I'll continue where we left off yesterday. It says, "As perfidy seemed to be a common vice in those days among both popes and kings, Pepin had scarcely retired with his army from Italy before Astolphus, the Lombard king, made preparations to break his treaty by threatening to retake the provinces he had surrendered and lay siege to Rome." So Pepin had come forward and kicked out the Lombards and made the Pope a king. Okay, well, now Astolphus, the Lombard king, is having second thoughts and about ready to retake the land that he had lost to Pepin. So the Pope is getting real nervous right about now. And it says Pope Stephen III again had recourse to Pepin, urging him in the most imploring terms to return to Italy and defend his quote-unquote donation to the Holy See. In other words, his temporal domains to the Holy See. With him, the great question was the possession of the Exarchate of Ravenna, supposing that unless that were destroyed, it would become in the hands of the Lombards, who were Arian Christians but defended the worship of images, too formidable as the ecclesiastical rival of Rome. In other words, the ecclesiastical power and the temporal power of the Pope was being challenged by Astolphus, the Lombard king. Now it says it is quite certain that this was the chief ground of quarrel between the Pope and Astolphus, and that, quote, if the Pope had allowed the Lombards to occupy the exarchate of Ravenna, they would have been loyal allies of the Pope, unquote. The Pope, therefore, could not keep his anxiety within moderate bounds and addressed several letters to Pepin. In one of them, according to Cormenin, the historian, he says, quote, I conjure you by the Lord our God and his glorious mother, by the celestial virtues and the holy apostle, and who has consecrated you king, to render to our see the quote-unquote donation which you have offered it, unquote. Thus again invoking the aid of religion in securing temporal power to himself. But Pepin was not so ready as before to embark at an enterprise which offered no further prospect of gain to himself, and indicating some indifference to these appeals to his religious sentiments, the Pope was driven to a still more desperate expedient, that of sending him several letters purporting to have been written by the Virgin Mary, by angels, martyrs, and saints, and one by St. Peter himself, all of which, it was alleged, had been sent down from heaven for the purpose. Don't you just, you just see this age of superstition. I mean, today this would be laughable, one would think at least. But then, when the Pope said, I've got a letter in my hand addressed from St. Peter the Apostle, conjuring you to come to my defense, it got attention back then. Okay? And it says the translation of that letter from Peter is thus given by Dean Millman. And here's what this letter is supposed to have said. Quote, I, Peter the Apostle, protest, admonish, and conjure you, the most Christian kings Pepin, Charles, and Carloman, with all the hierarchy, bishops, abbots, priests, and all monks, all judges, dukes, counts, and the whole people of the Franks. The Mother of God likewise adjures you, and admonishes and commands you, she as well as the thrones and dominions, and all the hosts of heaven, to save the beloved city of Rome from the detested Lombards. Don't think this is over. It's still going here. Listen what he says further. This is St. Peter the Apostle speaking. If ye hasten, I, Peter the Apostle, promise you my protection in this life and in the next, will prepare you the most glorious mansions in heaven, and will bestow on you the everlasting joys of paradise. Make common cause with my people of Rome, and I will grant whatever ye may pray for. I conjure you not to yield up this city to be lacerated and tormented by the Lombards, lest your own souls be lacerated and tolerated in hell with the devil and his pestilential angels. Of all nations under heaven, the Franks are highest in the esteem of St. Peter. To me you owe all your victories. Obey, and obey speedily, and by suffrage our Lord Jesus Christ will give you in this life length of days, security, victory. In the life to come will multiply his blessings upon you above his saints and angels. Unquote. There you go. That's what Peter sent down from heaven in the form of a letter, and I'm told that it was supposedly written in molten gold, And the Pope delivers this message to Pepin, or to Charlemagne, and Pepin commands him to come back to Rome and kick those Lombards out again. Okay? You see how Rome abuses her so-called representation of Christ on earth to achieve temporal ends that have in no way any influence on the truth, on Christ, on the gospel. It's a man-made institution. It feeds on the earth to grow itself. And God's people are always the victim. We have a union of church and state taking place right now. The church commanding the state to come and wage war in the name of God. That characterizes papal control in the world. Do you see that happening today? It's happening all over the world. And God's people need to at least come to grips with the possibility, at the very least, the possibility that the Pope still exercises this prerogative in the world today. No less than he ever did before. No less than the times about which we are reading right now in this book. What about the Mideast War? What about the war in Iraq? What about the soon coming war in Iran and the Middle East? The news is full of it. Might we suspect that the Pope is still trying to extend his temporal power all over the world in places where he could most take advantage of it, like Jerusalem, like Temple Mount in Jerusalem? We have to consider this. And it's the purpose of Inquisition Update to study this, to examine the possibilities, and to warn God's people. Are you really fighting for freedom, or are you fighting for the Pope, for a new world order, where the Pope is restored to his so-called throne over God's creation? Now, we continue with the book. He says, we can account for this letter and its contents only upon the supposition that its author considered himself as standing in the place of God on earth, or that he was entirely indifferent to the means employed, provided they produced the results he sought for. The ignorance and superstition of the age was such as to encourage this mingling together of divine and temporal things. Now remember, divine and temporal are just other words to describe the union of church, that being divine, and temporal, that being state. Okay? The ignorance and superstition of the age was such to encourage this mingling together of divine, or church, and temporal, or state, things. And Stephen III was the kind of pope to avail himself of it, notwithstanding the impious and blasphemous character of the act. He understood the temper and position of Pepin, and knew that he considered himself indebted to Pope Zachary for his crown, and to the priests of France for the encouragement of that popular superstition which enabled him to maintain it under the pretense of divine right. And he did not miscalculate. Whether Pepin believed that the letter came from heaven and directly from St. Peter, or that the Pope, as God's vicegerent, had the prerogative right of committing so palpable a forgery, it is of no present consequence to inquire. He yielded to the entreaties of the Pope, and again advanced to Italy with his army, acting doubtless from the conviction that if he did not, the clergy would persuade the people of France that he was defiant to the commands of the apostle and deserved the anathemas of the church. You see, Rome put the king of France between a rock and a hard place. You either come back here and get rid of this Lombard king, or I will turn the Christians of France against you, and you will be overthrown. Suppose that condition of affairs still exists between the papacy and the kings of the earth, particularly the President of the United States. Now, this time, however, his movements were attended with no other immediate consequence than the surrender of Ravenna to the Pope, and probably the confirmation of his former donation. Cormenin speaks of the subsequent deposit of this quote-unquote deed of gift upon the confessional of St. Peter by Fulrad, the counselor of the French king. But we have already seen that the probabilities are against the existence of such a document, and that the gift of Pepin was only verbal. The papacy to this day has not produced any documents confirming the gift or the donation of Pepin, justifying the Pope's temporal power in the world. Now, Astolphus, the Lombard king, did not long survive these events. He died in the year 756, when a controversy arose about the Lombard crown between Didier, king of Istria, and Ratchis, a monk. The latter gained Pope Stephen to his support by promising not to disturb him in his possessions of Ravenna, and that he would make large donations, quote, to enrich St. Peter, unquote, an object of which the popes have never lost sight. But Pepin did not favor this arrangement and took the side of Didier. The Pope then, from policy alone, abandoned the cause of the monk and recognized Didier as the lawful sovereign of Lombardy. He was not disposed, however, to change sides so readily without some reward, and succeeded in obtaining from Didier a concession of the city of Faenza and the duchy of Ferrara and some other places. So true was he to the purpose of enlarging the papal domains and the establishment of the temporal power of the Pope. He soon after died in the year 757 and was succeeded by Pope Paul I. The events of the three next pontificates have no special bearing upon the question we're considering, except as to show for the controversies about the worship of images between the popes and the emperors continued, and that Didier still cherished the purpose of seizing upon the exarchate of Ravenna. All the plottings and political intrigues of him and the popes had reference to that object, each being resolved to possess it at every hazard. Pepin died in the year 768 and left the kingdom to his two sons, Karl and Carloman, the former of whom, at the death of his brother, became the sole possessor of the crown by the name of Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. In the year 772, Adrian I became pope. During his pontificate, which lasted 23 years, the political alliance, this union of church and state between the papacy and the French king, bore other fruits not less conducive to those already born in the advancement of papal power. When Charlemagne became king, he found all the nations of Europe in a state of comparative decrepitude, and inheriting the sentiments and courage of his father, resolved upon making the French monarchy the controlling, absorbing power in the West. Now, you must know, before I even continue, that Charlemagne was setting himself up to become the emperor of the West, and this is treason. Remember, we've been talking about this trumped-up difference between the East and the West. The Caesar having left Rome, the restrainer having left Rome and gone to Constantinople, leaving a power vacuum in the West for the rise of the Pope and the king, King Charlemagne. in the West. So we have the Roman Empire being divided into two legs. Remember the vision of Daniel? The metal man image, the head of gold, the shoulder and arms of silver, the thighs of brass, and the two iron legs. Iron is representative of Rome and of crushing the people. This empire, this Roman Empire, was split into two legs, the East and the West, and this is how it took place. Bible prophecy again being fulfilled in history. Now, not satisfied with the possession of France and Western Germany, Charlemagne extended his dominion into Italy, Spain, and other parts of Germany, which of necessity brought him into immediate intercourse with the popes. Fully informed of the advantages his father had derived from their employment of the ecclesiastical power in his behalf, he readily saw that his interests required him to make a similar use of them. So here we have again Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the son of Pepin, retracing his father's footsteps and seeking help from the papacy, and also the papacy seeking help from the French king, both of which are designed to advance their temporal power as opposed to the legitimate authority in Constantinople. This is the division of the Roman Empire into two legs. And he says, he therefore gathered about his court distinguished, quote-unquote, foreign priests from all the leading nations, who besides being men of great learning were, quote-unquote, the light of the church, and the kinsmen, quote, of bishops and saints, unquote. So he's surrounding himself with the rich ruling elite, just like they do today, surrounding himself with Roman Catholic clergy and very important people of the Roman Catholic Church. This is to help him in his appeal to the papacy. See how the state uses the church and the church uses the state in mutual endeavor to increase their own power. He says he professed strong attachment to the Roman Catholic Church and its religion, and there's no reason for supposing that he was insincere. But as he understood it, the church and its teachings were designed as aids to his political power. Beyond this, it is probable that he cared but very little for either. With these opinions, he was readily induced by the influences around him to strengthen the ecclesiastical power in France. In other words, to increase the power of the priests in France. And certainly you have to understand that increasing the power and prestige of the priests in France would further ingratiate him to them and the Pope. Now it says, being, says Michelet, the historian, sure of the Pope whom his family had protected against the Greeks and Lombards, he displayed his great sagacity as a statesman by these movements, designed as they were to bring all the authority of the church to bear upon the measures of his reign. Two measures were especially conspicuous, and we'll get to those measures when we return from the break. Here we have Charlemagne, just like his father Pepin, getting in bed with the scarlet harlot in Rome to ingratiate his own self, to increase his power, and what power he achieved through his alliance with the papacy. It says he professed strong attachment to the Roman Catholic Church and its religion, and there's no reason for supposing that he was insincere. But as he understood it, the church and its teachings were designed as aids to his political power. Beyond this, it is probable that he cared but little for either. With these opinions, he was readily induced by the influence around him to strengthen the ecclesiastical or priestly, the Roman Catholic priestly power in France. Quote, being, says Michelet, sure of the Pope whom his family had protected against the Greeks and the Lombards, unquote, he displayed his great sagacity as a statesman by these movements, designed as they were to bring all the authority of the Roman Catholic Church to bear upon the measures of his reign. Two measures were specially conspicuous. He, quote, confirmed the institution of tithes. He confirmed the institution of tithes, which required that 1/10 of all taxes levied upon the people should be paid to the churches and the priests. So here we have state sponsorship, financial assistance to the church. This is a state-sponsored church. Are we seeing that today in the United States of America, the so-called Protestant nation? We have George W. Bush entering upon this endeavor, which, if the term will come to me, it's escaped me now that I want to bring it up, but the religious initiative in this country. And Charlemagne also freed the Roman Catholic Church from secular jurisdiction. Do you see that happening in the country today? You see the church having, the Roman Catholic Church having immunity from the secular power. That's right, from law, from the courts, about all the pedophile priests that are commanded by the Roman Catholic Church, if they be caught in bed with a child, that matter be held by the church and not by the courts of the United States. That's exactly what's happening in this country, and Rome's behind it all. He said he also freed the church from secular jurisdiction, that is, made it independent of the states by a law found in his capitularies in these words. Listen to this law. Quote, it is our pleasure that neither abbots, nor presbyters, nor deacons, nor subdeacons, nor any priest whatsoever be brought before the public and secular tribunals, but be delivered for trial to their bishop, unquote. You see the historical precedent for what the popes did during the pedophile priest pandemic, which is ongoing in the world? They tell the states, hands off my priests. I will take care of my priests. And justice is rendered by the popes and not the secular courts in this country. This is a most assured sign of the union and cooperation between the Roman Catholic Church and the government of the United States. No different today than it was in the days of Charlemagne, where this precedent was set. And it says his munificence toward the clergy was unbounded. Quote, he augmented their wealth, he enlarged their privileges, he confirmed and extended their immunities, and were it not that he was one of the greatest and wisest princes who ever reigned, some writers would not have hesitated to place him among the weakest of mankind. Guess where Inquisition Update would place him? The weakest of mankind. And that's exactly where I place our presidents today. That's where I place many of our Protestant pastors today, for failing to bring these things to the attention of the minds of God's people. And we are repeating the mistakes of the past because we're too timid, too holy to be stained by talking about true history. It's just too dirty to touch. It's too easy to denounce as religious persecution. It's too easy to denounce as Catholic bashing. So we leave our hands off of it. Leave the people ignorant of what's happening, what's taking place before our very eyes. It is to be condemned. And we need to start dealing with the truth. Now, he continues, and his direct dealings with the Pope were not less distinguished for their liberality. He was a consummate statesman, far the greatest of his age, and was quite willing to leave the popes to the gratification of their ambition when it did not interfere with the success of his own measures. One object he was specially desirous to accomplish. This was to sustain the popes in their defiance of the Eastern emperors, that thereby the seat of the empire might be transferred from the east to the west. In other words, it was a power struggle. All of this is designed to eventually topple the supremacy of the Eastern emperors and return that power to Rome. You see Satan working here in the background? He who now lets will let until he be taken out of the way, and then that man of sin shall be revealed. This man of sin in Rome is to become all-powerful in the world. Rome, or Constantinople, is going to be usurped and has been usurped throughout the reading of this chapter. This is Satan working in the lives of evil, wicked, self-serving men, the least of which not to be the Pope of Rome. Charlemagne helped the Pope, and the Pope helped Charlemagne. The whole deal was treasonous and sets the foundation for the power that controls the kings of the earth today. Now, besides his wars with the neighboring nations, Charlemagne had a quarrel with the Duke of Bavaria, which furnished him an opportunity of availing himself of the alliance between the Pope and his father, and of making religion serve the purpose of promoting both his own and the Pope's ambition. Pope Adrian I, in full sympathy with his purposes and plans, took his side against the Duke of Bavaria and launched a terrible bull of excommunication against him and all his subjects, not for any offensive act against the church or religion, but on account of objects entirely temporal. It is necessary to observe the character of this bull in order to understand the progressive steps toward the acquisition of temporal power, and to see with what little remorse of conscience sacred things were mingled with political controversies and made subservient to ambitious ends. If, in order to make an act infallible, it must concern the faith alone and be addressed to the universal church, then it would be unjust to say that this bull was stamped with that character, that is, infallibility. But if, when the Pope speaks in the name of God, he speaks ex cathedra, in other words, from the throne of Peter, then Adrian I was infallible when in this bull he declared, quote, that the Franks were absolved in advance from all crimes they might commit in the enemy's country, and that God commanded them, through his vicar, that is the Pope, to violate girls, murder women, children, and old men, to burn cities, and to put all the inhabitants to the sword, unquote. The obligations between the Pope and the King were, of course, reciprocal, and required each to serve the other, the one with the thunders of excommunication, and the other with the thunders of artillery. The Pope had a quarrel with the Duke of Beneventum because the Duke refused him permission to make money levies upon his subjects for increasing the revenues of St. Peter. And Charlemagne, in return for the sanctions which the Pope had given in God's name, of all the enormities his armies might commit in Bavaria, despoiled the Duke by force of 5 of his best cities and added them to the domains of the Pope. You see how this unholy fornication between the kings of the earth and the papacy lay the cities in ruin? This defines all of history. And it goes on today, right in front of the face of God's people. And few are willing to recognize it, and even more few are willing to denounce it. The alliance now began to bear richer and more abundant fruits, which had become so ripened as to be ready for plucking by either party, according as temporal interests or ambitions stimulated him. Adrian I died, however, before they were all gathered, and left it to his successor, that is Pope Leo III, to compensate Charlemagne for his munificent gift. This was done by Leo in a manner that calculated to gratify the vanity of a less ambitious king than Charlemagne. He sent him the, quote, keys of the confessional of St. Peter, the standard of the city of Rome, and the magnificent presents, unquote, and urged him to send some French lords to Rome who should receive the oath of temporal fidelity from the Romans. For as yet, notwithstanding the donation of Pepin, the Pope had not ventured to make any pretensions to the rights of a temporal king. In other words, he became a temporal king, but he judiciously kept that proclamation quiet so as not to raise any hackles in Constantinople. Now, it had not been revealed to him that the law of God made this necessary for the protection of Christianity and the Church. The presence of weaker and feebler kings than Pepin and Charlemagne was necessary to such a revelation as this. Charlemagne did not, of course, object to being made emperor, for that was one of his cherished objects. But bad as the times were, he had so just a sense of shame that he desired the vices of the Roman clergy to be the first reformed. All right, now Charlemagne's going to he's got a chance to become the emperor of this new Western power growing in defiance of the Eastern Roman Empire. But first, he's going to reform the Roman Catholic Church. You see, the Roman Catholic Church has always had trouble with its celibate priests. Naughty little boys they are. And despite their outward pretense of piety and chastity, they're whoremongering dogs. And right out in the open. And they were losing credibility, as they always did throughout history. So Charlemagne's going to try to rein them in a little bit. And it says these were so flagrant, these sins of the priests were so flagrant that he considered it a reproach to Christianity that they should be tolerated under the very eye of the Pope. And so Charlemagne wrote to Leo III urging the application of corrective measures. Here we have Charlemagne ordering the Pope to clean up the act of the priests. Okay? Who's reigning the authority now? It's Charlemagne, right? Now, Pope Leo, unwilling to take issue with him upon the subject, indicated a wish to make the desired reform. But whatever efforts were made in that direction proved abortive on account of the opportunity of the clergy of Rome, who organized a conspiracy against the Pope. Now, you don't suppose somebody suggested that they shut down the brothels for the priests? Well, that's exactly what happened. And so the priests were going to get shut down, their little whoremongering operations in Rome. And they took that as a grave offense. And so they sought to kill the Pope to stop this reform of the Roman Catholic Church. You can't reform the irreformable. And Rome is just as decadent and filthy and whoremongering and pedophilic today as it ever was. The only difference between today and back then was some liberals in the press are willing to talk about it openly and to bring it to the people's attention. You don't suppose that might be the job of any Protestant priest you might be familiar, or Protestant pastor you might be familiar with? No, because some Protestant pastors have the same problem. Because they, like Charlemagne and so many kings and religiosities before them, have also got in bed with the Pope and his whorish church in Rome through the ecumenical movement. So they share this religious monstrosity and they also share in her sins. What does the Bible say? It says, come out of her, my people, that ye partake not of her sins, and that ye receive not also of her plagues. For her sins have reached unto heaven, and God hath remembered her iniquities. And that's why the pastors of the United States Protestant churches do not openly condemn these Roman Catholic priests, because they've got secrets of their own. Has been brought about by the ecumenical movement to reunite with this whorish Romish church. They have partaken of her sins, and they are partaking of her plagues. About these reforms, it says, but whatever efforts were made in that direction proved abortive on the account of the opposition of the clergy of Rome, who organized a conspiracy against the Pope. 2 priests, aided by the monks, made an attempt to take his life, seized him in the streets, dragged him by the beard, sought to break his skull with stones, to put out his eyes and to pull out his tongue, and at last plunged him into a dungeon. He was, however, released after several days of confinement, when, fearing a renewal of the attack, he invited Charlemagne to visit Rome that he might more certainly secure his protection. The invitation was accepted, and the great king entered Rome in December of 800 A.D., when the Pope, placing the crown upon his head, it says the invitation was accepted, and the great king entered Rome in December of 800 to save the Pope's life. Remember, we were talking about the priests who were threatening to have their brothels shut down and all their sexual deviance to be exposed and condemned. They went after the Pope to kill him, and the Pope pleaded with Charlemagne to come and liberate him from his own priests. Charlemagne enters Rome in December of 800, and the Pope placed a crown upon his head. You don't suppose he was making him Emperor of the West? That's exactly what was happening. And he turned over to Charlemagne the part of the empire with as cool impudence as if it were his to bestow. Remember, the Pope claims to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He believes the earth is his and the fullness thereof, and it is within his power to grant landed possessions to the kings of the earth. Remember, it's the union of church and state. Politicians like Charlemagne and popes scratch one another's back, and together they form a beast that only God can destroy. But it's up to God's people to recognize it for what it is and condemn it and distance themselves from it and repudiate it and make their allegiance with Christ. It says, Charlemagne entered Rome in December of 800 when the Pope placed a crown upon his head, turned over to him that part of the empire with as cool impudence as if it were his to bestow, declared him emperor, crowned as such by the hand of God. You see, the Pope considers his hands the hands of God Almighty, and it is his divine prerogative to be able to create kings and to take down kings at his will, as if it were Christ doing it. Now it says two objects were accomplished by this stroke. Of policy. The Pope's treason to the empire was made effectual. Here we have the western leg of iron being now distinguishable from the eastern iron leg of Roman Catholicism. And Charlemagne was made the emperor of the Romans which placed the diadem of the Caesars upon his brow. So this treason has now run its course. It has become an obvious fact on the ground. The iron legs, both east and west, have now been a fulfillment in history. And the beast will have his reign until Christ returns. That's what's rarely talked about. The prophecy of Daniel makes it clear that those two legs of iron will proceed into the iron, the toes and feet of the image, and will continue to trample God's people until that stone that was cut out of the mountains without hands strikes the image in its feet and grinds it to powder, and it blows away in the wind. This Roman Empire continues in power until Christ himself destroys it. I'll see you tomorrow.